So my study is testing the social and psychological factors connected with gambling addiction. And just for some context, I'll define what gambling addiction is. According to the National Council on Problem Gambling, gambling addiction is gambling behavior that is damaging to a person or their family. It often disrupts their daily life and career. But gambling addiction is just a blanket term for 4 different degrees or severities of gambling addiction. The first one is non-problem gambling addiction, and this is when a person gambles with no consequences. It doesn't interfere with anything in their life or their relationships. And then next comes low-risk gambling addiction. This person will gamble more than someone who's a non-problem gambler, but it still wouldn't have any negative consequences on their life. And we also have a moderate risk gambler. This person would start to see minor consequences, but still nothing major. And then finally, problem gambling addiction is the most extreme form of gambling addiction, and this is where the person will start to see negative effects on their relationship, in life, stress, and overall emotional damage. So what's missing in the current literature of gambling addiction? Well, there's a conspicuous gap on studying adolescents. There are many studies testing how personality traits and psychological factors affect adolescents or adults' likeliness to be addicted to gambling, but there's no studies relating to adolescents. And the problem here is that adolescents are extremely vulnerable to gambling addiction. Around 29% of them exhibit one of the dangerous degrees of gambling addiction, and that's moderate risk gambling addiction or problem gambling. And this is scary because 83% of gamblers have lost money. Adolescents don't have the foresight to understand the risk they're getting into with gambling addiction, so this makes them especially susceptible to losing money. The research question I'll be testing is what specific social and psychological factors are correlated with an increased likelihood of adolescents developing addictive gambling behaviors. As for my literature review, the first factor I'll be looking at is other addictions. According to Stephen Weiss, 43% of college students addicted to gambling had other addictions, including nicotine, alcohol, and drugs. Another addiction that was very strongly correlated with gambling addiction was internet addiction, and this makes sense because many people who gamble online. The proven correlation between gambling addiction and other types of addiction shows the need for further research, and this is something I'll be delving into through the lens of adolescence. Next, we have the correlation between gambling addiction and personality traits. Neuroticism and stress have been 2 potential factors that have been identified as possible predictors. And this could be causative because of escapism. Escapism is when a person looks to an activity as a way to run away from the stresses and anxieties of life, and gambling addiction is a popular way of escapism. Finally, conscientiousness has been identified as a positive factor that can protect people from gambling addiction. People who are more conscientious and think more about the consequences of their decisions will be less likely to fall victim to gambling addiction. As for the correlation between gambling addiction and mental health, depression and anxiety have been shown as predictors, and again, like with stress, this could be causative because people could look to gambling addiction as a way to escape their depression and anxiety. However, the research is slightly conflicted on the strength of these factors because many experts believe that depression and anxiety are things that lead people to addiction in general and not specifically gambling addiction. As for the method I'll be doing, I initially thought about doing a meta-analysis, but this was deemed not viable because there was not enough data on adolescents' gambling addiction and personality traits. So what I will be doing is a survey based off the Problem Gambling Severity Severity Index. The Problem Gambling Severity Index is a 9-question test that tests a person's severity of their gambling addiction from the 4 degrees of gambling addiction I talked about earlier. It's been confirmed through third-party testing, and it's the most popular way to test gambling addiction severity through studies in this field. I'll also be including questions on a Likert scale about the personality traits that I talked about in my lit review. So I'll be asking people to rate how strongly they are, for example, conscientious, or how strongly they feel depressed on a scale of 1 to 5. And then for how I'll be analyzing that data, I'll be employing Pearson's R correlation coefficient. And this has been proven to be the best correlation method, not only for studies in general, but also for studies within gambling addiction. It's the most widely used in my field of study. So the two variables that I'll be correlating are the composite problem gambling severity index score. So this will tell me how addicted that person is to gambling, and I'll be able to correlate this with their answers to the personality questions, which again I'll be asking on a scale of 1 to 5. So I'll have numbers to correlate with both. And then as for my results, for other addiction, that was the strongest correlated factor out of all of them, and I had an R value of 0.6224. And then stress was weakly correlated with an R value of 0.0342. Conscientiousness was weakly negative correlated with an R value of negative 0.3313. Depression was weakly positively correlated with an R value of 0.2078. Anxiety was weakly positively correlated with an R value of 0.2360. Impulsivity was very weakly negatively correlated with an R value of negative 0.0809. Anger was also weakly negatively correlated with an R value of negative 0.0383. So now I'll be analyzing this data and comparing it to other studies within the field. As for the data I found on other addiction, my results that there was a strong correlation between other addiction and gambling addiction is consistent with the current literature that I talked about in my literature review. And one reason for this comes from the National Institute on Drug Administration. They did a study testing people who had several addictions, and they found that there was a genome that correlated with people having 2 or more addictions. So it's possible that some of the participants in my study had this genome, which could have led them to being addicted to gambling addiction as well as other addictions, but I would need another study surveying them to test this. As for my data on anxiety and depression, they both had weak correlations, which does coincide with the existing research, as the existing research has a weak consensus that they are predictors. And as I talked about this earlier, this is likely because escapism. Gambling can provide psychological distress and excitement for people experiencing things like depression and anxiety. As for my results on stress and anger, I had very weak, almost non-existent correlations, and this is not consistent with the data I talked about in my literature review, as they consider stress and anger 2 strong predictors of gambling addiction. And one reason I thought this could be is that my sample is very different from theirs. So I was testing exclusively adolescents, and the studies I'm comparing myself to tested exclusively adults. And research has shown that adolescents deal with emotions like stress and anger differently than adults do. So it's possible that they wouldn't look to gambling, whereas adults may. And then as for conscientiousness, I found a weakly negative correlation, which does somewhat correlate with the literature. The literature finds conscientiousness as a strongly negative correlation with gambling addiction. And higher conscientiousness causes teens to think about the consequences of their action further, and this leads them to act more cautiously and avoid things with negative consequences like gambling addiction. So one limitation on my study was that it had a smaller sample size than similar studies. My sample size was only 178 participants, while other studies I looked at had around 250 to 400. My personality questionnaire may be flawed because it was testing a person's perception of their personality, and I wasn't able to test how they actually acted. One way I could have done that is by interviewing their family members or friends to ask them how strongly they exhibited the personality traits I was testing. However, this would have been very difficult to do with 178 participants. I don't believe that this was a strong problem, as studies have shown that our perception of our personality is generally accurate as long as it isn't related to how open we view ourselves. And then as for the implications with my study, I have found a strong correlation between gambling addiction and other addictions. So further research could look at this interplay and test that genome I talked about, where people are more likely to have 2 or more addictions. Also, we could look at the strongly correlated factors with gambling addiction and test how we can stop adolescents from exhibiting those personality traits so strongly, which could go to the root cause of gambling addiction. And then finally, with my conclusion, the literature review displayed the research on gambling addiction and its interplay with other factors in the existing research with adults. And then my results showed what I found through the correlation with these factors among adolescents. And finally, I think what I talked about in the discussion showcases the need for mental health consideration when preventing adolescents' gambling addiction. Thank you, that's it.
Thanks, Niket. The panel's gonna have 3 questions for you, and I'll start out. So how did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to the final research question you ended up with? Can you talk a little bit about how the literature led you to this?
So before looking at the literature review, my initial idea was to do something around the gambler's fallacy, which is where people think the last result when they're gambling will affect future results. But as I looked into the literature review, there was a lot of studies already about that, and I found it hard to find a gap. But one thing I was interested in was how the type of things that would lead people to gambling addiction. And I found that when I was looking through the literature review, there were many studies done with this on adults, but in terms of adolescents, there were almost no studies. And I had a large population of adolescents as I go to a high school.
Fantastic. And as a follow-up question, how did the limitations of your method or the data, how did that influence your new understanding? Like, which parts of that new understanding do you feel confident about, but which others do you feel less confident about due to the limitations of your study?
As I talked about in my limitation section, one thing I was not fully confident about was my questions about adolescents' perception of their personality, because my goal was to test how they were, their actual personality traits, but what I really asked was how they perceive themselves. And one thing that I feel more confident about was how I tested their degree of gambling addiction, because I used the Problem Gambling Severity Index, and that's been proven in this field to be extremely effective.
Terrific.
Question I have is, obviously, you're very interested in this topic. Do you have what other ones that you're interested in, and what would you consider as another research area?
Well, one thing within this field that I was especially interested in was the interplay between other addictions. So why do people feel addicted to multiple things? What causes that, and how can we prevent that? And that was something that, as I researched my topic more and more, that repeatedly came up. I had a strong correlation between other addiction and gambling addiction. So that's something that I will look into the future.